everyone. My name is Steve Schwartz, and I'm the founder of the Lsat Blog. I've been coaching the Lsat for over 10 years now, and you might be wondering, how did someone like me want to get into this business? I certainly never thought this is what I would be doing with my career. I always thought I would go on to law school. I was a political science major in college, and I always was very interested in politics. And so I thought, well, I want to work with the law. Maybe I'll do criminal law. Maybe I'll do corporate law. I'm not really sure. But with the humanities background, I knew that med school wasn't my future. I always thought I was a really smart person. Maybe my ego was a little bit bloated. And I was expecting to at least get in the 160s. And my goal was a top 14 law school. So getting a 152, it doesn't really make you feel too great. And I took another practice test. Same thing happened. So I took more and more practice tests, and my scores remained in the low 150s. But I became kind of obsessed with this because my ego was tied up in it. And I also, of course, did want to go to a great law school. I hadn't worked as hard in undergrad as maybe I should have. My GPA was something like a 3.2 or 3.3 in a political science major, when with great inflation, I should have been getting closer to a 4.0. So I committed myself fully to this. At the time, there were only something like 40-something exams maybe, and I did every single one of them. I did every single released LSAT, and I did every single LSAT prep book I could find. And very slowly, over the course of what ended up being an entire year, I ended up bringing my scores up to a 175 on test day. And after that, I started helping out friends and, friends of friends who were studying for the LSAT. I would give them advice, maybe even sit down with them, go through a few problems. And then I started tutoring the LSAT. And I started tutoring it because I had tutored other subjects in the past. And so I figured, well, if I can tutor the SAT, I've learned the LSAT well, I've been through that process, I've struggled personally myself. Why don't I tutor other people for the LSAT? And so that's what I did. And given that it's such a niche subject, there was a lot of demand. And so over time, I tutored more and more until it became my full-time thing. I stopped tutoring all the other subjects I had been tutoring. I focused on the LSAT and grew to love it more and more and became increasingly obsessed with it. And so I never ended up going to law school in the end. It's now been over 10 years, and I still continue to love the LSAT, and I still continue to learn more along the way. My understanding is not complete. I'm not getting 180s every single time. But I found that the rabbit hole goes deep, and it doesn't need to be a process where you personally are reinventing the wheel. There are people like me who've already been through this process. I've created over the years a website, the Lsat Blog, which with over 1,000 articles on every aspect of LSAT preparation, from the different sections and the different question types to study schedules and resources like guides, checklists, and cheat sheets. And so on the Lsat Blog, just Google it. You'll find all the resources there. I've even put more there than I've put on my YouTube channel, although I'm adding a lot to YouTube lately. If you want to go to the homepage on YouTube, it's youtube.com/LSAT blog. I release new videos almost every weekday on average. I also have a podcast, LSAT Unplugged. And so these are some new areas I've been exploring where I conduct interviews with law school admissions folks, other LSAT folks, students going through the process. I actually record coaching sessions sometimes and put them on there. And this is my passion. It's my obsession. I truly love it. I always find a new angle from which to view the exam and new perspectives, new ways to explain things. And so that's what I do. I have full courses covering every section of the exam: logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension, the law school personal statement, as well as a test day success course focusing on mindset, things like reducing LSAT test day stress and anxiety and properly simulating LSAT test day conditions. So I've really tried to look at every aspect of this exam. Aside from the courses and the written resources, I also do a bit of one-on-one coaching, although I work with a very limited number of students for each test administration. So if that's something you're interested in, of course, please feel free to reach out. I do have a link below this episode if you'd like to find out more about that or the courses or any of the other resources. But anyway, that's my story. That's my journey. This is what I do full time. I'm not doing other things on the side. I don't have a day job. This is my passion. I work around the clock creating new resources whenever I'm not working one-on-one with a student. That's my focus. And so if there's a resource you'd like to see, if there's someone you'd like me to interview on the podcast or YouTube channel, please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear your suggestions on any new materials I might create for you. Now, one thing I can talk about is that there are a lot of changes coming in 2019 with the LSAT. LSAT is going through a number of changes. It's a transition period moving to the digital format. There's only one LSAT test date remaining where you are guaranteed to get the paper and pencil format, and that's June. Beyond that, it's going to start the transition to digital. The July LSAT will be 50-50 digital paper. Half of students will be assigned the digital format, half will be assigned the paper and pencil format. LSAC chooses for you, and you don't get any advance notice. So I don't know about you, but I really would not want to be in a situation like that. I would much rather at least know which one I'm getting. And then beyond that, September, everyone's getting digital going forward. Now, for July, to maybe help you deal with the ambiguity and the stress a little better, they are offering you a unique one-time opportunity to see your score before canceling. That only applies to the July LSAT, no other LSAT test date. So that might remove the stress a little bit. It's good to know your score before you have to cancel, when in most cases you're canceling blind. But still, I don't think it's good to go for July. And I actually am not a huge fan of the digital format in general. There's a lot of clunky features in its interface. You can't really draw freehand on the screen. At the 5-minute countdown, you can't get rid of the countdown clock. So I would find that a little bit nerve-inducing. And if your LSAT prep strategy involves making notes or diagrams on the page, on the text of the question, just know that with the digital LSAT, you're not going to be able to do that. So make sure you're ready for that change. You can actually practice a little bit with the digital interface. Go to familiar.lsac.org and you can practice on a mobile device, on a tablet, or on your computer as well. I do recommend using a tablet if you can, because it more closely mirrors what your experience will actually be like. And so it's worth investing in a tablet if you can. LSAC is using the Microsoft Surface Go, but a Samsung Galaxy tablet might be a little bit more affordable. But if you can, you've still got some time to go for June if you want to knock it out of the way with the paper and pencil format. One thing you should know in addition is that starting with the June LSAT, the writing sample will be online. So you won't be doing it at the test center after you've done 5 sections of LSAT content. Instead, you'll be able to do it at home at your leisure for, I think, up to a year after your LSAT test date. And so that's nice because you'll also only have to do the LSAT once. And they'll monitor you with a webcam and a microphone to make sure it's really you doing it. They'll have you show your government ID to match the picture and everything. But it'll at least be easier. You can do it when you want, and you'll only have to do it once. I've spoken with some law school admissions folks about this, and what I've heard pretty much unanimously is that they don't really look at the writing sample, except in cases where there might be a question over someone's English fluency or whether they wrote their personal statement themselves. But because it will be typed, it'll be slightly more legible, and so maybe that'll make them slightly more likely to actually look at the writing sample. One thing I can talk about is the order of approach for LSAT logical reasoning questions. You can approach the questions in the order that works for you. If you're aiming for a 160 or 165 plus, you want to get through the entire section, of course. And so you've got to have pacing that allows that. 35-minute constraint on a logical reasoning section or any LSAT section is unreasonable by nature. They've constructed this exam to make it so you will not be able to complete the questions in the time allotted. In fact, you're almost kind of weird if you can. And so you do that by having an unreasonable pace. You want to work through the first 10 questions very quickly. The first 10 questions are easier on average. There is a general order of difficulty. And so if you can blast through those first 10 questions in something like 10 to 12 minutes, you will build up a time bank that you can apply to the tougher questions later in the section. If you're already at a 160, even there, you have a decent foundation already. You've demonstrated that. So trust yourself. If you think it, you're probably right. They're not throwing a ton of tricks in there on the first 10. And then you will have more than the average allotted amount of time per question to apply to the tougher questions later in the section. My goal for you is that you finish the section with about 5 minutes remaining, and then you can go back and handle the toughest questions that gave you trouble previously. Anyone completing an LSAT logical reasoning section, it's okay if you have 3 to 5 questions you were not entirely sure of. But what you don't want to do is get bogged down in the moment, investing minute after minute, and have nothing really click for you. It's stress-inducing, it's nerve-wracking, and then you fall into this situation where you are moving forward in the section, but you're still stressing and thinking about that earlier question that didn't really click for you, and it brings your entire performance down. That's the funny thing about LR, as opposed to games or reading comp where the questions are grouped in. So perhaps if your understanding of the game is good or the passage is good, you're more likely to get the entire game or passage right. Logical reasoning, they're bite-sized, and so they don't really relate to each other, except they will relate if you're still thinking about one later when you shouldn't be. So what I want you to practice is the art of letting go. It's almost like a mindfulness or focus practice where you train yourself. You give yourself the self-control to let go of a question, maybe be down to 2 and just pick one and move on, or flag it and move on. One of the cool things about the digital LSAT is that you will be able to flag questions and see at a glance all the questions you flagged to return to later. So that's kind of nice, but you've got to train yourself to let go and trust that you'll be able to come back later. And coming back later with a fresh perspective can help you break out of the tunnel vision that you may have been experiencing that was preventing you from making headway on the question. So if the question was, let's say, overly technical or science-oriented language when that's not your thing, or let's say it was a tough parallel question or a question involving formal or abstract language, you might be a good idea for you to skip it, return to it later, especially if it's a question where your odds were relatively low anyway. Since everything is equally weighted, every question is worth the same, you don't want to spend time on a tough question and not even get to an easier question that comes later. It's possible that question 24 or 25 will actually be easier than questions 19, 20, or 21. Now you might ask, how do I deal with tough abstract language? The answer is by practicing it. These questions only come up every so often, and so you might not see enough in any one study session to really notice the trends or thoroughly ID or define the terminology for yourself. So I have a drill to recommend for you. I want you to take a couple sections worth of just tough formal logic-based questions or abstract language questions, maybe do 25 or 50 in one sitting, and define all the terms for yourself in all 5 answer choices. By doing them all at once, you'll actually start to notice patterns in how they're referring to things, what they really mean, what a subsidiary conclusion is, what antecedent or consequent is, and how they relate. So define these things for yourself, look them up for yourself, especially if you're a non-native speaker. This is really important because things do repeat. These things will come up again and again and again. And so if you don't learn to spot the patterns in your mistakes, you will make them again. One of the most common LSAT mistakes I see is when students confuse necessary and sufficient assumption questions. These questions are often lumped together under the catch-all category of assumption when they're actually very different from each other. And it's extremely important to view these questions from the proper perspective. Necessary assumption questions are actually a very specific kind of must-be-true question. A lot of people treat these as strengthening questions, which is a mistake. Necessary assumption questions are properly viewed as inference or must-be-true questions because they're asking you for something that is necessary if the argument is assumed to be true or is as given. For example, if we had as given the statement, God created the world, then it is necessary to assume that there is or was a God at some point. It would be impossible for God to have created the world if there never even was a God. So if we take the stimulus given information as fact, then we can necessarily assume that there is or was a God at some point again. So the necessary assumption is something that the argument depends upon. It's something the argument requires, and it's something the argument assumes. And so you will have in the question stem words and phrases like these that are synonymous with necessity. Again, they're depends upon, requires, and assumes. Now, that's in contrast to sufficient assumption questions, which have words and phrases that are synonymous with sufficiency. So those are verbs like allows or enables, or phrases like follows logically if assumed and properly inferred if assumed. And so an example here would be, let's say as given, you were buying a $1 item. It would be sufficient if you had $100 to buy a $1 item. $100 is not required, it is not necessary, but it is sufficient. And so it's important to view this from the proper perspective. $20 would also be sufficient but not necessary. $5 would also be sufficient but not necessary. And you might ask, are there ever cases where something is both sufficient and necessary to assume? And the answer is yes, kind of like how a stopped clock is right twice a day. You could have $1. Having $1 would be both necessary and sufficient to buy a $1 item. But that rarely occurs. The vast majority of the time, you need to know which question type you're dealing with. And I'm friends with a former writer of actual LSAT questions, and we were chatting recently, and he told me that one of the common tricks they use is confusing students by putting a sufficient assumption answer choice when the question is necessary assumption. And if they're being really sneaky, they'll do this where answer choice A is a sufficient assumption, but the correct answer appears later as a necessary assumption because that's what the question type was. So it's very important to view these from the proper perspective. Now, I don't want you to focus too much on question types, though we're doing questions by type, because it's also very important to view the method of reasoning and evaluate the argument itself. A lot of times I'll speak with students and they tell me that they're getting lots of questions wrong, but they're not noticing any trends in which question types. Or even worse, they might say they're getting lots of necessary assumption questions and flaw questions wrong. And my response in that case is, well, you might be getting a lot of them wrong just because there are a lot of them to get wrong. Not all questions appear with equal frequency. Necessary assumption questions and flaw questions are two of the most common question types. And so you might get more of them wrong because there are more of them to get wrong out there. You're doing more of them. But it's also very important to think about the stimulus. We could take a given argument and insert a variety of question stems associated with that argument and change the question type. So let's say we have an argument, conclusion, we should eat at that restaurant. Evidence, it has a 5-star average rating on Yelp. So if we wanted to strengthen this argument, we could say something like the restaurant has 1,000 reviews, or we could say that Yelp has good filters on their reviews. And so for that reason, we can trust a 5-star rating. They're not inundated with fake reviews that are getting past the filters. The restaurant reviews are not primarily from the restaurant owners, friends, and family who may be biased, of course. And on the flip side, if we wanted to make this a weekend question, we could say that the restaurant maybe only has 1 review, or all the reviews are from the restaurant owners, friends, and family. Or we could say that Yelp is not good at filtering out bad reviews. Or we could say that people who are reviewing the restaurant are not particularly discerning customers who have good taste. Or maybe we don't like the restaurant's cuisine. So there are a variety of ways to strengthen or weaken this given argument. We could also turn it into, let's say, a resolve the paradox question by saying in the stimulus, that restaurant has a 5-star rating, yet we decided not to eat there. What might explain this confusing or puzzling situation or paradox? There's never any such thing as a real paradox on the LSAT. All situations can be explained. And so it would help to resolve this situation if we learned that the restaurant's reviews on Yelp are not reliable indicators of whether we should eat there. Maybe the reviews are fake, or we don't like the cuisine or something like that. So it's important to thoroughly understand the argument itself so that we can play around with it, tinker with it, and view it from a variety of perspectives. And if you notice that you're getting a lot of questions wrong and you're not sure why, you're not noticing trends, think about the stimulus, think about whether you thoroughly understand the stimulus before moving on to the answer choices. Too many students rush ahead to the answer choices when they don't get the argument because they're hoping it'll help. In fact, it will only further confuse you because the choices only make sense in the context of the stimulus. So you've really got to understand the stimulus, then look at the answer choices. So during your review process, ask yourself, was your problem with understanding the stimulus, the argument, or with understanding the answer choices? Check for that. Then, if it was in the answer choices, look at what was it about their choices. Was it something about the wrong answer choice that made it tempting? Or was it something about the right answer choice that made it discouraging and pushed you away from it? LSAC will lay traps of encouragement to lure you towards wrong answer choices. And they will lay traps of discouragement to push you away from right answer choices. So you want to look at what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it, and what ultimately made it wrong. And what was discouraging about the right answer choice that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately made it correct. You want to do this again and again and again. You can actually save a separate file folder of every question you've ever gotten wrong or had difficulty with to review multiple times. You can photocopy or reprint multiple copies of your exams so you can redo the questions with fresh copies. This is especially useful for logic games, but you can do it for any type of LSAT question, whether it be games or reading comp as well. And you might say, well, my understanding will be influenced. I'll be more likely to get it right because I've seen it before. But the thing is, you're not doing questions just to evaluate yourself and just to see how you'll do. You're doing the questions because you want to better understand the methods of reasoning and the particular traps that you are falling into. The LSAT makers might have 1,000 traps or tricks they love to use, and you're presumably not falling for all of them, or you'd consistently be getting 120s, right? So you're not falling for all of them, only some of them. The question is which ones. Maybe you're falling for a couple dozen or 100 out of 1,000. And so you want to figure out which couple dozen, which 100, and practice those again and again and again, because the LSAT makers, they do have a limited bag of tricks. It might seem like a lot, but if you do even just 10 exams, you'll start to notice patterns. You could even there's nearly 100 released exams at this point, 86 of which are numbered. But you could even do just 10 exams ever, repeatedly, and that would be enough for you to spot the trends in what you're getting wrong so that you don't make the same mistakes again. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please subscribe to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And if you email me at lsatunplugged@gmail.com with a screenshot of your subscription to either the YouTube channel or the podcast LSAT Unplugged, I will send you a free LSAT checklist. And if you go to my website, the Lsat Blog, there's a link on there to download a free, easy LSAT cheat sheet. And it has links within the PDF to various free resources to help you on every single aspect of LSAT preparation. So check them out. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. Please, again, feel free to reach out if you need anything at all. I love hearing from students. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.